Good afternoon, all. I'm Brad Winstead, first-year teacher at Airline High School in Bossier City, Louisiana. Before we get started, let me just go ahead and acknowledge I'm probably not what you would consider to be a traditional first-year teacher. I'm a 47-year-old former HR professional who spent 25 years assisting employees for some of America's largest employers in their industries, those industries being the oil and gas industry, the gaming industry, and the telecommunications industry. I spent years assisting those employees, and now I feel compelled to enter the classroom and assist these students in becoming marketable employees. I'm fortunate enough to be one of the first teachers in Bossier Parish to get to teach Introduction to Remote Vehicle Technologies, or what we call drone technology. Students participating in this class are being trained to successfully complete the Federal Aviation Administration's Aeronautical Knowledge Exam in an effort to obtain one of these, a Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems Remote Pilot's License. Obtaining that license opens vocational doors to these students if they have an interest in pursuing careers as professional drone pilots. Glassdoor, as of the time of this recording, is suggesting that the average starting salary across the country is about $60,000, with a starting compensation package of $80,000, which is certainly above the median for the Shreveport-Bossier metropolitan area. The Aeronautical Knowledge Exam is comprised of 5 parts. Those would be drone regulations, airspace, operations, weather, and aircraft loading and performance. The subject of today's lesson is standard temperature and standard pressure in aviation, the concept of standard lapse rate, and the concept of density altitude. The objectives of the lesson are to provide information in lecture format with multimedia being PowerPoint presentation, and to have students express understanding of this information by having them calculate pressure, altitude, and density altitude questions that will be asked on the Federal Aviation's Aeronautical Knowledge Exam. Prior to today's lesson, students have already been learning the subject of weather and have a basic understanding of how weather affects aviation and how weather impacts drone flight. Before being dismissed for the day, students will pair up in groups we call pilots in command and visual observers, and together they will assist each other in calculating density altitude and pressure altitude in an effort to make these lessons more memorable. So let's get started. All right, somebody take the first bullet point for me. Mr. Johnson.
Relative humidity also affects physical altitude, but should have minimal impact on drone performance.
But should have minimal impact on drone performance. Why? Why would we suggest that relative humidity has minimal impact on drone performance? Can anybody go ahead? It could, but what this says is that we would have minimal impact on drone performance. Why would we expect very minimal impact based on relative humidity? Why would relative humidity not really matter to a drone pilot? What's the maximum height we can fly a drone? 400 feet, right? So how much is relative humidity going to change between the surface and 400 feet? Not much, right? It's going to be what we call negligible. Would everybody agree with that? What's the highest we can fly over the highest structure? Still 400 feet, right? So if we've got this building or the hospital over here at roughly 70 feet tall, the highest we can fly our drone is what? 470 feet, right? And if that's the case, relative humidity is not going to change much between the surface and 470 feet, which is why it doesn't have much of an impact on unmanned aircraft systems. All right, on drones. All right, air molecules in the atmosphere, they thin out, right? They spread out, which means that, remind me, what are the 4 forces that impact flight? Lift, thrust, drag, and weight, all right, which gravity plays an important part on, right? Thrust, when we're talking about decreased drone performance, as molecules spread out in the atmosphere, there becomes fewer molecules for the propeller to push against, right? Reducing lift. Does this make sense? The propeller has to work harder, generating more thrust to push against fewer molecules, providing reduced lift. That's when we say drone performance is reduced.
That's what we're referring to. All four propellers on our drones have to work harder to generate the same amount of performance or the same amount of thrust or lift, all right? All right, last bullet point. Would somebody tackle that for me? I'm gonna give somebody else a chance because you already read one, all right? Mr. Hall.
A combination of high temperature, high humidity, and high altitude result in a density altitude higher than the pressure altitude, which in turn results in reduced aircraft performance.
Okay, thank you very much for all of you who volunteered to read. Quickly, let me point out, if you were paying attention to the first, both of those two bullet points, you recognize that as conditions change, performance decreases in both circumstances, all right? The first one said performance will decrease as atmospheric pressure decreases and altitude increases and temperature increases. And then it also says a combination of high temperature, high humidity, and high altitude result in a density altitude that is higher than the pressure altitude, which in turn, again, results in reduced performance of your drone. All things that the FAA expects you to take into consideration. Again, we can only fly at 400 feet, right? Over the tallest structure in the area. We can only fly at 400 feet. So in general, we're not going to be terribly concerned with calculating density altitude and pressure altitude here when it comes to flying our drones. Now, those of you who want to go on to become pilots, you will have to understand how to calculate those figures, all right? And you'll also have to understand how those figures impact the performance of whatever aircraft you choose to pilot, all right? Field elevations provided to you on these sectional charts, is it not? When we talk about field elevation, for every map, on every one of these maps, for every airport, there's data given, correct? Does everybody recall this? Data given in both MSL and AGL? Remind me again, what's AGL stand for? Above ground level, right? As long as you know that piece of information, the only other thing you need to know is what the altimeter setting is or what the pressure is in that location, all right? So by doing that, write this down, all right? In fact, I need a volunteer with good handwriting. Mr. Parton, step right up. Would you do me a favor, Mr. Parton, erase that previous example, and let's work on another one for pressure altitude. You ready? All right, field elevation in this case is 3,894 feet. 3,894 feet. Everybody write that down in a spot on their scratch paper. Our altimeter setting. Everybody see this column in that graph on the screen in front of them? Our altimeter setting is 30.35 inches of mercury. Wait, so we see 30.3 and we see 30.4, but we don't see a 30.35. We have to estimate, all right? It can't break it down by every single possible pressure setting. Mr. Borges. We absolutely could just take the average of the two. In this case, the easiest course of action is to do nothing more than round to the nearest half, which would be 30.5, right? It's always pressure when you volunteer to go to the board, isn't there? We're talking about pressure. What a weird coincidence. Lots of pressure. Not the same kind, though. You got it. You're there. And the answer well, wait a minute. Before we do that, before we give your answer, which is obviously on the board, what answers did you guys come up with? 3,500. 3,500? Anybody else?
Wait.
Mr. Chang, what did you come up with?
I'm not following along very well.
That's okay. That's okay. Mr. Dawson, you came up with 3,500? Okay. All right, Mr. Chang, let's make sure before we proceed, because we have to have this number to figure out density altitude, all right? So let's make sure that we're in the right spot, all right? The information that was already provided from our research looking at one of these maps, 3,894 feet is field elevation. That's mean sea level, above mean sea level, all right? 3,894 feet is field altitude or field elevation. We already know the altimeter is set at 30.35 inches of mercury, all right? All we have to do is find 30.35 in the altimeter setting chart right here. You found that? Or at least you found 30.3 and 30.4. The little bit of complicated math we have to do is take the setting for the factor for both numbers, add them together, and then average them out. Make sense? That's why Mr. Parton has negative 348, which is the factor for 30.3, and 440, which is the factor for 30.4. He added those together, got a negative 788, divided by 2, and he comes up with 394. All right? Taking that pressure factor and deducting it from the field altitude, which is what he did right here, gives us a total of 3,500. That's the pressure altitude. Really quickly, Mr. Johnson, excuse me 1 second. Let's go to the previous slide. Mr. Borges, thank you again for catching the error in this slide. This bullet point at 10,000 feet, standard temperature is negative 4.8 degrees Celsius. It should not say negative 23.3. It should only say 23.3.
I was so confused by that.
Yep.
It's just like, maybe it's right, and I'm just don't know what I'm talking about.
No, but listen, how often do we not say something because we're confused and we don't think we know what we're talking about and we're afraid of being embarrassed? You'll never know the answer to the question you don't ask, all right? Mr. Borges, very well done. Good job. You caught the error. All right. Hey, give Mr. Johnson and Mr. Parton a round of applause. By the way, let's go to the briefcase. Those of you that I said could go to the briefcase. I appreciate your work. Gentlemen, help yourselves. Nice. Mr. Borges, that's a good catch. You're going to do great on the aeronautical knowledge exam.
All right, we're back. I have been over the video. The lesson has been instructed. I've reviewed the video. I felt that the video suggested that the lesson was successful. However, I might have overestimated the success of the lesson. In reviewing it, I found that I had done two things that I should have done differently. The first one, I don't know if it was the act of recording the lesson itself, but I found that I was rather quick in getting through that, rather rushed, suggesting that I was nervous as a result of probably being videoed while the lesson was being provided, or observed while the lesson was being provided. And then two, one of the things that I'd failed to do, one of the things that I had not done adequately was clearly delineate a process. I did not numerically delineate the process. What I should have done in both my PowerPoint presentation and in my use of the dry erase board, I should have clearly identified steps, numbers. I should have put 1, A, 2, B, process-wise. I didn't do that. And I think that was necessary, or should have been necessary in the process. That particular component, the density altitude, pressure altitude, standard lapse rate, and whatnot, that was included in the Chapter 5 weather aviation exam. The exam is set up to kind of mimic the FAA's aeronautical knowledge exam. It is done as a multiple choice with only 3 potential correct answers, or 3 possible answers provided. The student scored a 79%, suggesting that, although I'd like to have seen that slightly better, it appears that the presentation of the materials was successful and most of the material was grasped. How would I do things differently moving forward? I think the next time we instruct this, in addition to the numbers, I'm just going to have to slow down. Chalk that up to nerves. I've spoken in front of large groups of adults, and yet I still find myself getting somewhat nervous when somebody has a camera and I'm providing instruction to a classroom of high school kids. So, thank you.